Hello, welcome to Midweek Bible video number 18, I think we're on. We'll be doing the normal stuff. We'll start with the New City Catechism Question 10. We'll move on to All Things for Good by Thomas Watson, and then we'll finish with a Bible study on Romans 1, 16 to 17. So last week we went over, we kind of learned question 10. What does God require in the fourth and fifth commandments? What does God require in the fourth and fifth commandments? Fourth, that on the Sabbath day we spend time in public and private worship of God, rest from routine employment, serve the Lord and others, and so anticipate the eternal Sabbath. Fifth, that we love and honour our father and our mother, submitting to their godly discipline and direction. This is obviously a gloss on Leviticus 19 verse 3, which is on the right here. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. That's one order. Often in the tables it's the other way around, which leads to a difference in numbering of the commandments between Catholics and Protestants based on which text they're drawing from. So again, this is a gloss on the basic commandments, summing up some of the implications. So on the Sabbath day, that's Sunday. The Christian Sabbath is Sunday, the first day of the week. We spend time in public and private worship of God, rest from routine employment, serve the Lord and others, and so anticipate the eternal Sabbath. And though the general question of Sabbath observance is quite complicated and broad-ranging, at the same time it's worth just putting down the marker that and saying that none of the other Ten Commandments are adumbrated or abridged rather, in the New Covenant. You're not allowed to murder. There's a higher requirement. You should also not be angry at people. You should avoid anger, but you should still not murder people. And it's the same with the Sabbath. Though there is greater meaning and depth to the Christian Sabbath, anticipating the resurrection and the eternal Sabbath, it's nonetheless still binding that we do physically observe. That which we don't do with our bodies but merely with our minds is often a fairly empty gesture, in the same way that you don't say, well, I'll do some good to my neighbour by thinking about them. You do what practical good you can. And yet the particular implications being the Sabbath is a time for special focus on God, for resting from routine employment. So you don't do your normal work on that day. If you're a teacher, you do not mark on a Sunday. If you are, that means even if let's say you're a church minister, you might well do good deeds on the Sunday, but you don't start preparing your next week's sermon on the Sunday, because that is your routine employment. You serve the Lord and others, i.e. do good works. You ask, and it's something I often seek to pray with my family, is that we have good works to do that Sabbath day. That might be just helping the poor, it might be visiting a friend, something might be practical, might be emotional, and finally, anyway, anticipate the eternal Sabbath. So that you look here towards Hebrews chapter 5, I think we're talking about, 4 and 5, and the idea that there is an eternal Sabbath which the wilderness generation sought but did not find, and indeed Israel did not truly find. There is still an eternal Sabbath to enter into, and the author of Hebrews, uses the two ideas of rest and Sabbath together there. There's a rest we want to enter into, which is God's rest, and he did not give that to the wilderness generation, but the church are seeking it, and when Jesus returns we will fully find it. So there's a kind of beginning of an enjoyment of the eternal Sabbath now. And the fifth commandment, we love and honour our father and our mother, submitting to their godly discipline and direction. Households are set up, created by God to mirror his relationship with us. Even though no father and no mother is perfect, they are lawful authorities, and they are given to us for our good, both in terms of reflecting God to us, but also in terms of practically teaching us good behaviour. And so we should love and honour our mothers and fathers because they are a depiction of God in the world in a very practical sense, but also because they're good for us. So we should submit to godly discipline and direction from them because we should trust them and we should want the good they want to give us. It doesn't mean that we simply we shouldn't worship them, and we shouldn't, that'd be idolatry, and we shouldn't follow every direction from them if it's sinful, if they're telling us to do something sinful. The same with Caesar, with the governor, the prince. But we do nonetheless do everything we can. We even love and honour them when they are in the wrong. We still show them love and honour as we explain that we disagree. We don't shout at them, we don't curse them. Another Levitical law is that if you curse or repeat, if you're basically a repeated curser of your mother and father, that you'll be stoned to death. It is that serious an offence of the heart. So, next week we'll do question 11. What does God require in the 6th, 7th and 8th commandments? 6th, that we do not hurt or hate or be hostile to our neighbour, but be patient and peaceful, pursuing even our enemies with love. 7th, that we abstain from sexual immorality and live purely and faithfully, whether in marriage or in single life, avoiding all impure actions, looks, words, thoughts or desires, and whatever might lead to them. 8th, that we do not take without permission that which belongs to someone else, nor withhold any good from someone we might benefit. And the quote you can see is actually from Romans, which we'll be moving on to soon. The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not commit murder, steal, covet, and any other commandment are summed up. You shall love your neighbour as yourself. So again, we've got this positive filling in of the commandments: not to murder, not to commit adultery, and not to steal. Next, we're on Thomas Watson's All Things for Good, and we are in chapter 3, Why All Things Work for Good, and we'll read the whole first point, which I think has 6 sub-points. The grand reason why all things work for good is the near and dear interest which God has in his people. The Lord has made a covenant with them. They shall be my people and I will be their God. Jeremiah 32:38. By virtue of this compact, all things do and must work for good to them. I am God, even your God. Psalm 50 verse 7. This word, your God, is the sweetest word in the Bible. It implies the best relations, and it is impossible that there should be these relations between God and his people and everything not work for their good. This expression, I am your God, implies 1. The relation of a physician, as if to say, I am your physician. God is a skillful physician. He knows what is best. God observes the different temperaments of men and knows what will work most effectually. Some are of a more sweet disposition and are drawn by mercy. Others are more rugged and knotty pieces. These God deals with in a more forcible way. Some things are kept in sugar, others are kept in brine. God does not deal alike with all. He has trials for the strong and cordials for the weak. God is a faithful physician and therefore will turn all to the best. If God does not give you that which you like, he will give you that which you need. A physician does not so much study to please the taste of the patient as to cure his disease. We complain that very sore trials lie upon us. Let us remember that God is our physician. Therefore he labours rather to heal us than to humour us. God's dealing with his children, though they are sharp, yet they are safe, and in order to cure, that he might do you good in the latter end. Deuteronomy 8:16. The word your God implies the relation of a father. A father loves his child. Therefore, whether it be a smile or a stroke, it is for the good of the child. I am your God, your father, therefore all I do is for your good. As a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you. Deuteronomy 8:5. God's chastening is not to destroy, but to reform. God cannot hurt his children, for he is a tender-hearted father. Like as a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him. Psalm 103:13. Will a father seek the ruin of his child, the child that came from himself, that bears his image? All his care and his skill is for his child. Whom does he settle the inheritance upon, but his child? God is the tender-hearted Father of mercies, 2 Corinthians 1:3. He begets all the mercies and kindnesses in the creatures. God is an everlasting Father, Isaiah 9:6. He was our Father from eternity. Before we were children, God was our Father, and he will be our Father to all eternity. A father provides for his child while he lives, but the father dies, and then the child may be exposed to injury. But God never ceases to be a father. You who are a believer have a father who never dies, and if God is your father, you can never be undone. All things must needs work for your good. This word, your God, implies the relation of a husband. This is a near and sweet relation. The husband seeks the good of his spouse, not to destroy his wife. No man ever yet hated his own flesh, Ephesians 5:29. There is a marriage relation between God and his people. Your maker is your husband, Isaiah 54:5. God entirely loves his people. He engraves them upon the palms of his hand, Isaiah 49:16. He sets them as a seal upon his breast, Canticles, Song of Songs 8:6. He will give kingdoms for their ransom, Isaiah 43:3. This shows how near they lie to his heart. If he is a husband whose heart is full of love, then he will seek the good of his spouse. Either he will shield off an injury or will turn it to the best. 4. This word, your God, implies the relation of a friend. This is my friend, Canticles 5:16. A friend is, as Augustine says, half of oneself. He is studious and desirous how he may do his friends good. He promotes his welfare as his own. Jonathan ventured the king's displeasure for his friend David, 1 Samuel 19:4. God is our friend, therefore he will turn all things to our good. There are false friends. Christ was betrayed by a friend, but God is the best friend. He is a faithful friend. Know therefore that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God. Deuteronomy 7:9. He is faithful in his love. He gave his very heart to us when he gave the Son out of his bosom. Here was a pattern of love without parallel. He is faithful in his promises. God who cannot lie has promised, Titus 1:2. He may change his promise, but cannot break it. He is faithful in his dealing. When he is afflicting, he is faithful. In faithfulness you have afflicted me, Psalm 119:75. He is sifting and refining us as silver, Psalm 66 verse 10. God is an immutable friend. I will never leave you nor forsake you, Hebrews 13:5. Friends often fail at a pinch. Many deal with their friends as women do with flowers. While they're fresh, they put them in their bosoms, but when they begin to wither, they throw them away. Or as the traveller does with the sundial. If the sun shines upon the dial, the traveller will step out of the road and look upon the dial. But if the sun does not shine upon it, he'll ride by and never take any notice of it. So if prosperity shines on men, then friends will look upon them. But if there is a cloud of adversity on them, they will not come near them. But God is a friend forever. He has said, I'll never leave you. Though David walked in the shadow of death, he knew he had a friend by him. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Psalm 23 verse 4. God never takes off his love wholly from his people. He loved them unto the end, John 13:1. God being such a friend will make all things work for our good. There is no friend but will seek the good of his friend. 5. This word, your God, implies yet a nearer relation, the relation between the head and the members. There is a mystical union between Christ and the saints. He is called the head of the church, Ephesians 5:23. Does not the head consult for the good of the body? The head guides the body, it sympathises with it. The head is the fountain of spirits. It sends forth influence and comfort into the body. All the parts of the head are placed for the good of the body. The eye is set, as it were, in the watchtower. It stands sentinel to spy any danger that may come to the body and prevent it. The tongue is both a taster and an orator. If the body be a microcosm or little world, the head is the sun in this world, from which proceeds the light of reason. The head is placed for the good of the body. Christ and the saints make one body mystical. Our head is in heaven, and surely he will not allow his body to be hurt, but will work for the safety of it, and make all things work for the good of the body mystical. So two things I pick up. One is just the way in which Watson fills that term, your God, where God says, I will be your God and you'll be my people. He fills that idea of God being our God with many things. He says, it doesn't just mean he's an abstract deity, but it means he's a father, a husband, a friend, and a father and a physician. Yes, that's one. And then finally he says he's the head. So God being our God means that he is a father, a friend, etc. And that's all contained in that concept of not just him being the God, but our God. The second thing I picked up on there was, I think, let's just flick down to find. Yes, this idea of friends often fail to pinch, many deal with their friends as women do with flowers. There's a point that the woman with the flower and the traveller with the sundial correctly use the flower or the sundial as a means to their end, pleasure or finding the time or whatever. And the observation that he makes here is that humans do the same with other humans. Look, you're not useful to me now, I have to go away. You were rich, now you're poor, I've no interest in you. Even though very few people go around saying, oh, that's exactly how I think, that is so often the case. Fair weather friendship, we call it, don't we? But God does not see humans in that sense as means, but as, in a limited sense, ends in themselves. He values his beloved children, at least, as his own body. He sees them as his own flesh. They are worthy. So though in one way we all exist to glorify God, when we are his children, we have a particular relation to him, which renders us uniquely valuable, which I think is very comforting, because we can think it's something where we can get tripped up on the idea that everything exists to glorify God, which is true. We exist finally for God's purposes, not for our own. But if we are the beloved of God, if we are in Christ, then he loves us as his own body. He sees us as worthwhile, even when we are not worthwhile, even when we are useless or pathetic. Now, on to Romans 1. Very short reading, though very pregnant with reading, with meaning reading. Chapter 1, verses 16 to 17. Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it's written, the righteous shall live by faith." There we are. So this is a very famous and justly famous pair of verses. Paul said in the previous verses that though he cannot now make it to Rome, he wants to preach the gospel to those in Rome who are, he says, in his spiritual field of authority. So he wants to preach them, and he has the right to. So now he sums up the gospel, and he sums it up boldly. He does not present it as a mere technicality or a friendly religious comfort blanket, but as something controversial and existential. Some people might be ashamed of it. Paul is not. And we'll return to that issue of shame after we've talked about the passage. Why would someone be ashamed of this gospel? If it's such good news, why would Paul need to say this? When someone makes a negative claim, in this case, I am not ashamed of the gospel, it's usually because they're countering the opposite view or claim. You don't go around saying, I'm not a thief unless someone's, for no reason, unless someone's accused you of being a thief. So yeah, we'll come back to that point. What is well, Paul is not ashamed, presumably because it is such good news. We'll wonder why he has to answer that later, but presumably he's not ashamed because it's such good news. What is such good news about the gospel, the good news? Well, it is the power of God for salvation. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is, because it is the power of God for salvation. That is some start. The gospel Paul preaches saves people. It is the way God exercises power to save. Salvation, the situation of being saved. Saved from what? We'll get to that in verse 18 next week. But we can say here that to the Romans the answer is obvious. Salvation is from this fallen world and from death, finally. It is to be rescued from doom. Salvation is always from something bad, it's not from something good. God is not saving us from something really good to something about the same. He is saving us from something very bad to something very good, you'd have to think. Jesus is the agent of the good news of God, as we saw in verses 1 to 6. So this gospel through Jesus is good news of being saved from an evil fate. It is the power of salvation to everyone who believes. So it is a salvation achieved by belief, faith, rather than by particular actions or systems. Belief and faith save, not actions and systems. Paul has already mentioned faith as integral to all of this in verse 5. His job is to bring about the obedience of faith in the non-Jewish world. And he has praised the Romans for their faith in verse 8. So faith is a big deal here. But faith in what is the big question? Paul also explicates in verse 16. Again, he explicates the recipients of the gospel. He's already brought up this point, but he repeats it again. First the Jew, then the Greek. And we can see this movement mapped out in both the book of Acts and in Paul's account of his ministry in Galatians. The gospel was first given in Jewish lands, particularly to the Jews, chiefly aimed at the Jews. But after Peter's vision in Acts 10 and Paul's conversion, which happens in Acts 9, but his ministry kind of begins later properly, God orders the church to extend this mission more widely to Gentiles. And the Greeks are Gentiles, that is, non-Jews. Paul particularly has, as he's already said, a particular responsibility for the nations. So though the Jews received the gospel first, by the will of God, the gospel is intended eventually for everyone. And we've seen the same point made in verses 5 and 13. We see this introduced as a theme in the prophets of the Old Testament, who are mentioned in a different context in verses 1 and 2. And those prophets speak of all nations coming to worship God. We see it in Jesus' ministry with the centurion, the Samaritan woman, the Syrophoenician woman. How often does he say something along the lines of, in those encounters, this person has more faith than any I've met in Israel. In verse 17, Paul finally sums up the gospel, or at least he gives it its headline. The gospel is the power of salvation to save first the Jew and also to the Greek. Now, Paul doesn't, and then he brings in the summary of what that is. Paul doesn't try to sum it up all now. He doesn't say, here's my 4-point gospel. His audience have already heard the general idea of the gospel, so he's going through topics systematically, developing points so that they can, a bit like in Hebrews, is it 5, where he says, we should really be moving from milk on to meat. Paul is really developing the themes of the gospel into a meatier conception for Christians who should be mature. And we'll have to therefore keep some of these points in mind in future weeks as we connect the different threads of Paul's argument. So, verse 17, for in it, the gospel by which the power of God saves, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it's written, the righteous shall live by faith. In the good news of God, God's righteousness is revealed. We'll get to the concept of faith, but first let's start thinking about the righteousness of God. This is going to be contrasted with the unrighteousness of men in verse 18. God is righteous. Is man righteous? We know that Paul's going to say no, but we can already sense it in the silence here, can't we? The righteousness of God. God is a righteous and good God who does what is right. His righteousness is not simply the attribute of holiness per se. Yes, God is separate from sin, but this is also about the proof of that, the doing of goodness by God. Shall not the Lord of all the earth do right? God is asked in Genesis 18 verse 25. And of course God does what is right there. God's name Yahweh means I am what I am, but also you could say, it means both what I am, but also I am doing what I am doing. God is right in all his dealings. He's not just passively separate from sin via an avoidance of action. He is actively separate from sin. He does good. The goodness, the righteousness, the holiness of God, the perfection of God are revealed in the gospel. And that sounds rather worrying. Even if we don't think we're terrible people, it's probably not good news that God is perfect and separate from sin. The classic thing people might say, I'm a good person. Nobody's perfect, of course, but I'm a good person. Well, if nobody's perfect but God is, there's a gap there, isn't there? So in the events surrounding Jesus Christ, Paul has mentioned his descent from David in the flesh, his divine sonship, his miraculous resurrection, the prophesied nature of his ministry in the Old Testament. In those events surrounding Jesus Christ, we see God's righteousness revealed. And yet somehow this is good news. In fact, it is good news because in it the righteousness of God is revealed. That is the very good news that we receive. Paul explains why next. This is in the middle of verse 17. From faith to faith, and then at the end, the righteous shall live by faith. And faith isn't in this context a behaviour or a work. It's a trust in someone or something else. And if you want to be righteous like God and live, which in the Psalms often has this added connotation of thrive, almost of life to the full, to quote Jesus, then you'll live by faith. If you want to live and not die, if you are virtually dying and want to live, and to again hark back to that language in the Psalms, you will have faith in God. The Christian life then is one of righteousness through faith, isn't it? Not then your own righteousness, not your own righteous acts. You trust in something or someone else, and here it comes to the believer from faith. And what is it? So as in life comes from faith. The righteousness of God is the it. The righteousness of God comes from faith. God's righteousness that sounds so far above us comes to us from the act of faith. And for those of us more familiar with Christian belief, we can see what Paul is going to say. It's the great idea of imputation, of being credited with someone else's deeds. Paul will develop that argument in full from chapter 3 onwards, but right now he's just beginning to hint at it. The great faith the Romans have is in something or someone else. And obviously everyone hearing this letter in that Roman church knew its faith in Christ. Believing in, trusting in Christ makes you righteous. It led to life. It led to the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. And without spoiling what's going to develop over the next several chapters, credit from someone or something else, imputation, is established here as the means of salvation. God's righteousness comes to us from faith. Paul establishes Christianity is not a system of good works that leads to rightful reward, but the righteousness of God himself somehow ending up credited to our spiritual account. Why would Paul then need to say he was not ashamed of this gospel? It's amazing. God's righteous, we may not be, but we get God's righteousness by faith. That's good news, right? Because it was not reputable then, and it is not really reputable now among pagans, to claim that the blessing of God appears as unearned credit, as God's own righteousness satisfying his requirements, rather than our own requirements. To the proud, this seems like an insult to human capacity and goodness. Why should I need God's approval? He should see how good I am already and just admire me. To the over-humble, to the fearful, it seems impossible that God could do such a thing, that he could give us his righteousness. But Paul, though those people might be ashamed or embarrassed of the gospel, Paul is not ashamed of this. Oh, in fact, one more quote that sums it up. Paul in 1 Corinthians says, the gospel is foolishness to Greeks and to Jews, because it lacks works or wisdom. It lacks miracles of the way the Jews like, and it lacks wisdom, philosophical wisdom of the type the Greeks like. It's not reputable. It's not as clever as these people would like. Obviously, you read Paul and you realise he's very clever, but it's not the kind of cleverness they want, and it's not the kind of impressiveness they want. Paul works wonders for the sake of bringing people to faith, but not for the sake of making himself powerful. So Paul then is not ashamed of it. Well, why? Because it is the only option. It's as if one were asked, are you ashamed of living by breathing? I don't need to breathe. I shouldn't have to breathe. By no means, it'd be foolish. And faith to the soul is even more vital than breath. So we conclude then this week on this claim that for a human to be righteous requires that they have faith and therefore receive the righteousness of God. And we'll see why this is necessary, why this is the only option, next week.